Every junk journal page starts with a background, but getting past that blank page and knowing what to do first can sometimes be the thing that stops you from journaling at all. So if you are looking for some journal background ideas and inspiration, I'm going to share with you the 5 things that I think about when I'm putting together any junk journal background, so that no matter what medium or materials you are using in your journal, you can apply this to whatever you are creating. And if you're new here, hi, my name is Meg. I make videos all about junk journaling, art journaling, and creativity. So if that's something you enjoy, then be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos from me. So as you can see by the journals that I have here, one of my favorite things to do in my journals is collage, and that can be all sorts of different types of papers, whether it's book pages, upcycled materials, brown paper. Truly the list goes on, but I find that starting off with layers as my first thing to think about with my backgrounds really helps me just to get going and immediately gets rid of that blank page. So if you have a plain journal and you haven't bound it yourself with a mix of different papers like some of the ones I have here, just laying down any sorts of papers, doesn't matter what order, whether things are overlapping, will start to put things on a page. So for example, here you can see in the background I've got layers of different papers, so you can tear them, you can overlap them and layer them up on your page to create a bit of a cluster. And I guess the point of layers, as one of the first things I think about, is that, like I was saying, it just gets something onto the page, it gets you moving. You don't need to think too much about what's going to be covered up, what will remain. And so by the time you have added all of your different papers and layers to your page, you'll then have something to respond to. Now, you might want to cover it up, you might want to preserve a certain piece and think, okay, that's now a part of the finished page. I don't want it to be a background element that's covered up. But one of the things that I think about a lot with backgrounds is that you kind of have to be not so precious, especially at the beginning, because we're just laying the foundations of a page. It's just the background. So you're thinking about how you can build up the interest and the different things that you've got going on. You can see here I use different like shapes and sizes of papers as well. So if you just have like, honestly, like random scraps of papers, they work really well just as ways to use them up and have them in a background. But also you can use larger pieces as well. So you can see here I've got like some pink pieces as well as some book pages. I've got some things that literally just had like some coffee and tea staining, and it just all adds interest for your background. So if you don't know where to start, I would suggest just start by layering some papers. All you need is obviously the papers and a glue stick to get going. So you could either cover the entire background, like have the page covered in the different layered papers, or you could focus on a certain corner of the page, like I have in this example where I have only worked on one side or like one corner of the page, and I've sort of clustered those together. So you can start to sort of build up that composition without thinking about it too much. Like you're just focused on where will the pieces of paper look nice together, and then that will steer you towards then what the end page might look like. The best place to start is to not focus on what it's going to look like, but just to have fun with placing your pieces down at first. And you don't need to commit to gluing them down either at first. You can always just place them and move them around and see where they might sit best before you commit to gluing them down onto your page. The second thing that I think about is texture. And again, this is linked to the papers that I use because I like to use a mix of different things. So when I'm thinking of texture, I'm thinking of anything from maybe like a little bit of wallpaper that I've got here that was just left over from something, but also, you know, brown paper. If you crinkle paper and that has the lines and the wrinkles in it, that will create texture. If you have maybe some leftover tissue paper that you're adding onto your background, one of my favorite things to do with that is to actually use some white tissue paper or one that's a little bit more translucent. And when you glue it down, it will kind of sink into the background a little bit. So you'll still get to see your papers, your initial layers through the tissue paper, but it will also add some texture that you can work with on your journal page. And that's a really good way if you are worried about having maybe a busier background and you're thinking, okay, well, with all these layers that we're adding to the page, how can I do anything on top of them? Having something like that that will push things back is a really great way to do that. And another way that you can introduce some texture to your pages after you've added your initial base layer of different collage papers is to introduce some paint or some mixed media elements. So one of my favorite ways to do this is with white paint. So I have this example here on a no-sew journal. So this is like a concertina style book, and this has some collage here, and I've just come in with some white paint on a stencil so you can see it's not like completely pristine and it's not all over the page, so you don't need to cover your whole page with every single thing that you're adding to your background. I think sometimes having small doses of things is a way just to build some interest and some detail areas without feeling like your whole page is being taken over by a certain element. So having some white paint, whether it's just brushing it on and doing some like abstract mark making, or whether it's like this and you're using more of a stencil, it's just about building that initial background layer that we can start to work with. And something else that I really like to add to my pages, which creates some interesting texture sometimes, is to actually do some coffee staining or some tea staining. And I typically just do this with a brush. So I'll just get like a little cup on the side with like a tea bag or some coffee or what have you, and then I will apply it with a brush. And then sometimes if I'm drying it, maybe with like a hairdryer or something, you can kind of create different areas of interest on the background here. So you can see this is an example where I've got both the tea staining and also the paint, and you can just see how it kind of goes across the different pages and creates that sort of textured effect. So without adding too much bulk to your page. And especially I think I just like it for these no-sew journals, because this is a background element that if you add a bit of a layer over a few different pages, you're automatically getting that cohesion without things feeling repetitive, because you can sort of see the through line of the coffee staining or just the color palette running throughout your background. So that way then it starts to bring things together. So if you're working on multiple backgrounds, whether it's in a regular bound journal or whether it's in a no-sew journal like that one, it just starts to build that visual identity, I think, for your pages in your backgrounds that you don't need to think about too much, and you can then add whatever it is on top of that, but you've got that initial layer that is all kind of running throughout things. For example, on this page where I have the collage papers and then I've come in with the tea staining over the top of all of them, and this starts to bring them together. So rather than looking like separate pieces of paper all stuck onto the page, this immediately sort of unifies them and brings them together a little bit in terms of the background effect. So you don't always have to do super intricate and detailed backgrounds. Like, of course you can add those areas of interest. Like, I love to add little like doodles and mark making and little pockets of interest in my journals, but I think having something on the background that is fairly simple but still has that interest is definitely a great way to balance your journal backgrounds. And talking of the tea staining, adding that neutral colour palette that runs throughout your journals, that is the third thing that I think about when it comes to backgrounds, is of course the colours that I'm using. It's obviously no surprise that I love to use neutral colours, and so having those as my palette for my background really helps to bring it together. So if you like to use more colourful stuff, maybe, I don't know, greens and blues, or if it's warmer tones and you're sticking to that area of the colour wheel, picking one certain palette can really help you when it comes to putting together a background and it feeling a little bit more unified, and especially when it comes to creating then on top of the page, because you already have everything that's kind of similar on the background. Nothing is competing too much, so that way anything that you put over the top will immediately pop and stand out. So you can see I still have I'd say, you know, fairly colourful elements like on top, and a few different elements that are background pieces that are colours, but they're definitely more like a pop of colour, and so they stand out a little bit more. So I'm just thinking here, I'll grab this one again. I included these little like tissue paper circle elements just poking out in a few different sections here of the background, and you can just see the way that immediately draws your focus to them. So if I was to maybe cover the entire page with them, that would still look cool, but it would have a completely different effect. So you can definitely play around with your color palette when it comes to journal backgrounds. So, you know, even if it's something that is black and white, so you do only those colors in grayscale on your background, that way then anything that you then add on top of it will immediately pop if it's not black and white. And that leads into the fourth thing that I think about with journal backgrounds, which is contrast. So whether it's the text that I'm going to be eventually adding to the page or the different imagery, for example, I'm always thinking about how can I create a background that is going to provide that contrast, because the last thing you want really is to have everything blending into one on your page. So I have this here as an example. This has obviously collage and also some mixed media paint as well, but I added some black paint, which I'm not gonna lie, when I did this, I was a little bit nervous because this was so bold, and you know, nothing is going to contrast quite like some black paint on this neutral background. But I think it really helps with the composition. Even though there is still quite a lot going on this page, you are immediately drawn to this section, I think, just purely because of that contrast between the black paint and then the cutout section here. So, you know, even having, you've got all of these torn edges, and then we have this piece here that I've cut out just in a really neat circle, and with the lines of this label here as well, we're starting to create contrasts. You know, you have different layers of your background, but you can also play around with how they sit next to each other and how they're going to interact. That is something I always do, is to think about how a thing's going to be contrasting. So, you know, for this, for example, I ended up doing quite a muted background, and these flowers were from a napkin and they were really, really bright. So I decided to put some white paint over the top of them to push them back. So that way then when I added my letter stickers here, you can see they really pop and you really have that contrast. So, you know, if you need to push areas of your background more into the background, I suppose, like, you know, with white paint, giving them a bit of a wash and almost, you know, having those in the background so that other areas of your page can really sing. Don't be afraid to do that. So it's something I do a lot with text as well, is to have that pushed back so that you can still see it, like you can still see the detail and the things that I've added, but it's not all in focus. And I think I have another example of this actually in this journal here. Yeah, so you can see here what I've done is I created my background, and you can just about see where I had the book pages here, and I decided to push a lot of it back. This immediately splits my page into three, which, I mean, of course, the golden rule of three in terms of things looking a bit more visually pleasing on your page. So it really then helps to create the contrast, as you can see, between the different sections here, and almost makes these pop more because you notice them. So that way then you're able to use the space without giving up the initial texture that you added to the page, because you're still able to read the text clearly, but you can also see it's almost like the ghost of what was already on the page. And I think that's sometimes things that I enjoy more when I look at a page, when I can see all of the different things that have been added and the little glimpses of different areas of details. I like to do that just to create the contrast on my page. And I suppose that then brings me to the final point of backgrounds, which isn't directly something that you add to a background, but it's definitely something that I am thinking about. So even though I don't plan out most, if not all, of my journal pages, once I start adding the layers of paper and the texture and introducing the different color schemes that I'm going to be using and thinking about the areas of contrast on the page. Once I start adding the layers and the texture in the color palette that I've chosen for the page and creating those areas of contrast on the page, the final thing that I think about is my focal point. So I might have an image that I want to use or a quote or some text that I want to add. So like I was saying with this page, where I used the contrast then to be able to highlight my focal point. But because I matched my color of text to my background, the focal point is actually over here with the color. So I decided to separate those so that you still have the through line of the color and it sort of the background spills onto it, but your eye is kind of drawn more to the color then. So by using the neutral background, that kind of informs then the focal point of the page. So for example, with this piece here, you can see that I actually left one of my background pieces completely plain, and I put it next to a piece here that was patterned because I knew then that I wouldn't cover up any of this. So this immediately starts to create a focal point, and what I've done then is worked all of my papers sort of around this, and any mark making I've done here just with some Neocolors and some white pen, I've then worked around and created almost a little bit of a border. I've really avoided this sort of center piece, so sometimes I'll work just on one page, sometimes I'll work across both, but I suppose having in the back of my mind where I want to focus things can help me to put a background together. So, you know, like I said, sometimes this will just emerge naturally as you're putting pieces together and you find that certain pieces sit well next to each other. So it's definitely something that I think as you do more journal pages, it sort of starts to evolve, especially in your own different style, however you are journaling. So I hope you enjoyed seeing these different examples from my junk journal pages, and I will see you in the next one.